the program on Georgian Studies at the Davis Center, and I will be moderating today's discussion on the evolving geopolitics of the South Caucasus. The recent Armenia-Azerbaijan peace deal stands to reshape not only bilateral relations, but the strategic landscape of the region and its ties to the wider Black Sea. For Armenia, this new chapter offers a measure of relief after decades of conflict while raising critical questions about sovereignty, security guarantees, and the country's long-term geopolitical orientation. For Azerbaijan, the agreement represents a consolidation of regional influence and creates fresh opportunities for energy and trade connectivity. This moment also poses an important challenge for the United States, which must calibrate its foreign policy to support long-term stability while navigating growing Russian, Turkish, and Iranian involvement in the region. And for Georgia, situated at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, their implications are far-reaching. Shifts in transit corridors, democratic development, and relations with the European Union all hang in the balance. Today's webinar will bring together 4 distinct perspectives, Armenian, Azerbaijani, American, and Georgian, to unpack how this peace deal may redefine regional dynamics and what it means for the future of the South Caucasus, the Black Sea, and global foreign policy. I'm delighted to welcome our panelists and all of you for joining us. Our speakers today, Anna Ohanyan, Anar Yaliev, Mark Kramer, and Natia Chankvetadze, will each offer opening remarks of approximately 5 to 7 minutes. Following these presentations, I will pose several questions to the panel before we open the discussion to the audience. There is a Q&A function at the bottom of the page, so you can please pose your questions there. Given our limited time and the high level of interest in the topic, I will briefly summarize each speaker's biography at the time of their remarks. For those who wish to read their full profiles, the complete bios are available on the event page on our website. Our first speaker, Anna Ohanyan, is the Finnegan Distinguished Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Stonehill College in Massachusetts. Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Allison, and big for the invitation, and big thanks to the Davis Center for organizing this event. I'm really thrilled to have this conversation. I have been asked to speak about the Armenian perspective, but I do need to manage expectations somewhat. I don't think there is a single Armenian perspective on the formation of TRIP, and that might be a good thing. There is an active and heated domestic debate currently unfolding with pretty specific hybrid warfare dimensions coming from Russia, trying to undermine the process, both the peace process as well as the TRIP agreement. But paradoxically, this debate ultimately can strengthen the agreement because it is tested and contested within the Armenian political arena. The key challenge here is that much of the discussion continues to be framed in geopolitical lens: Russia versus the US, the peace process, relations with Azerbaijan, all unfolding in the immediate aftermath of the ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh and the violent dissolution of its institutions. So the second reason as to why I might not be able to speak for an Armenian perspective as such is that my scholarship over the past decade has been centered on a single question: how do regions pacify? And it is from this regional lens, regional perspective, that I view the TRIP initiative, situating it within the larger dynamics of regional stabilization and connectivity. Overall, I think super quickly, so I would like to highlight as to what this agreement, TRIP, is and is not. I do think that this reads to me more like a non-aggression pact rather than a peace agreement. It is dyadic, it is directed in managing the rivalry, long, very enduring rivalry between the two states. And it is very much focused on affirming the international norms governing interstate relations. It is reinforcing the Almaty principles. All of these are really critical for South Caucasus at large in terms of reinforcing, regionalizing the international legal order in the South Caucasus. It also highlights that U.S. seems to have more vested interest in the region. And of course, the Caucasus Central Asia connection is really important. But I would argue that there are a variety of ways to assess the effectiveness of the implementations of any agreement, and in this particular agreement as well. I would argue that if the agreement succeeds in moving the rivalry towards stable peace, I would consider that a success. More than half of peace agreements do not last, but at the same time, I think U.S. involvement is really significant, despite the risks that it also entails. So in terms of, let me say a few words in terms of the levels as to what implications does it have for the region and beyond. I would argue that the trip is very much shifting the strategic geography of the Eurasian continent. And it is doing so at a time when Russia's geostrategic centrality is declining. This is historically quite significant. And in this respect, U.S. is signaling its intentions to become a stakeholder for connectivity in the region and create an opportunity for the region to transform from a post-Soviet to a pre-Eurasian, so to speak, a region, while but at the same time, I think the ability of the South Caucasus to emerge as a region, as a space, as a territory, so to speak, with political autonomy, that there's very little that a single agreement can do. And I think here a lot depends in the capitals as to how they see regional dimensions, their regional statecraft whether they can hold the implementation of this agreement or not. At the regional level, this agreement helps to create, especially the creation of the TRIP in Armenia South. It helps to diversify and modernize connectivity and regional autonomy in the South Caucasus. It also helps in moving the rivalry, addressing the rivalry in between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which in the conflict literature is described as a dangerous dyad. One is a nascent democracy, the other one is an authoritarian state, but it is a personalized authoritarian state. So in this respect, the regime type is really important in how these two states will negotiate. It presents risks and opportunities. It does, so in this respect, the agreement is promising in creating economic incentives, creating pooled benefits from in the region-wide in order to make the consolidation of peace process effective down the road. Also at the regional level, I already mentioned, it reinforces the language of the agreement is very specific in reinforcing norms against conquest for territorial sovereignty. And this is really critical for this still post-Soviet region. The fact that this is a region of small states structurally in the international system is significant because the Eurasian continent remains this so-called new imperial continent, Russia utilizing new imperial strategies of influence, Turkey as well. And I'm citing Jeff Mankoff's very good scholarship book on this topic. So regional autonomy without consolidating, coordinating, enhancing regional autonomy, none of the three countries will be able to craft a sustainable position for themselves in this particular neighborhood. The fact that Russia, again, and I'm not even speaking about the Russian invasion in Ukraine, but is speaking much more broadly, Russia continues to seize its influence in the region in new imperial terms, and regional autonomy is really important for all three states. State level implications for peace research. This I see as a partial peace agreement, if we're going to call it as such. But even as a partial peace agreement, it increases the likelihood for a comprehensive agreement down the road. It allows Armenia to elevate its nodal position in world politics, and allows Armenia to develop a niche in regional and global diplomacy. I do see it being risky that U.S. involvement is personalized and transactional. And this is really, we could call it as commercial peace. We can perhaps discuss as to what opportunities and risks it presents. Now, in terms of the In terms of the risk, I do again. This isn't. I think we have to be realistic as to what a single agreement can accomplish. And the dominant discourse, much of the discourse is focused on geopolitics. A lot depends on the agency of the three states, all three states in particular. So I think the TRIP agreement has been very important for all the things that I mentioned, creating a tool for the regional states to enhance regional autonomy, elevating South Caucasus in the shifting Eurasian strategic geography. But at the same time, I don't think it addresses there's very specific tensions on the Azerbaijani side, I would argue. On the Armenian side, I think the weakness of institutions inside Armenian state is problematic. So that would be the influences, the Russia influence does continue for all kinds of ways, and we can discuss that. But I do think that in terms of, again, political economy perspective is really critical to understand what is and is not possible at the regional level. And here on the Azerbaijani side, and I'm working on a paper on 3 countries. I will not speak on Georgia today simply because I'm still researching Georgia. But in case of the Azerbaijan, here, I think the dilemma is between openness and control paradox, right? So Azerbaijan, on the one hand, does need the openness to market, infrastructure, investment, connectivity, which are necessary for Azerbaijan to address the structural vulnerabilities in its energy-dependent economy. But the openness also reduces the regime's capacity to control information, movement, and economic elites. And every step towards regional integration creates an equivalent loss of political insulation. To put it differently, we can also think about in terms of this pursuit for connectivity, links, infrastructure, participation in regional value chains. All of that is good. But it enhances national competitiveness for all states. But for Azerbaijan, it does expose the regime to pluralizing pressures, right? Railways, pipelines, cargo routes, all of this is great, but they also move norms, expectations, networks that challenge concentration of power. The agreement is also limited in terms of the monitoring is pretty weak. Implementation structure is not clear to me at this point. Again, if you look at it, compare it to some of the best practices, best metrics of what are the successful attributes of peace agreements. Again, the implementation structures are somewhat weak, even though there's talk of creation of trilateral various agreements, working groups, and that I think is really important. If the conversation and the network start moving, become institutionalizing, and starting to link governmental officials across between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but also ideally involving Georgia. So yeah, I think, and we can also probably talk about Russia. On the, much of again, much of the agreement tends to focus on at the geopolitical level, but Russia essentially this agreement highlights that Russia lost its sort of traditional monopoly on being a security provider, and this fight trying to remain relevant as in some sort of a so-called conflict management role. And in this respect, Russia will try to reassert, try to have some sort of an agreement signed in Moscow. Now and then you hear rumblings coming from the Kremlin. But the scholarship on peace agreements already now demonstrates quantitatively that Russia actually globally is a country that scores highest in terms of initiating peace agreements, but ranks very low when it comes to implementation. So Russia does not have capacities for implementation. But Russia continues in terms of the hybrid warfare inside Armenia, which I follow more closely ahead of the upcoming elections. In terms of continued risks, I think there's a lot of worry here. The devil is in the detail, and I will conclude here. The language, one risks that I see is that the text of the agreement is very clear in terms of the reciprocity. that it provides enhanced connectivity for Azerbaijan to connect with its exclave Nakhchivan, but also Armenia to there's reciprocal connectivity for Armenia to connect to its southern regions through Azerbaijan as well as internationally. But there is nothing in terms of synchronization. What is the sequencing of these things happening? And in this respect, the scenario does remain whether, and perhaps Anar can elaborate a bit on this, but I think the scenario, the possibility for Baku to use this, taking advantage of the lack of synchronization as a way to push for connectivity with Nakhchivan and Turkey without unblocking the region in general. That scenario is very there because again, it's quite risky for regime stability to promote full-on open regionalism, and I hope to be wrong here. The Turkey's role is obviously important. I have been writing 2 pieces on this and continue to research this. So far, Turkey's approach to South Caucasus remains personalized, transactional, rather nationalistic. And in that respect, Turkey has not, the border with Armenia remains closed. And in this respect, the open border would have elevated Turkey's strategic position in the Eurasian continent. In that, I think also limits as to how far, what can the trip as an agreement accomplish. I'm probably already used up my time, so I will stop and hand it over back to you, Allison.
Thank you very much, Anna. Next, we will hear from Anar Yaliyev. Anar is an associate professor at ADA University in Baku, Azerbaijan. Anar, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Alison. Thank you very much, Anna, for this really great kind of introduction. What I would say that from Azerbaijani perspective, what are the main concerns and opportunities that is lying down in front of the Azerbaijani state is that from Azerbaijani perspective, the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan is over. There is nothing that can just put certain type of the obstacles in building cooperations or relations with Armenia. As our president and several elite members of political establishment simply stated, there is no more conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Nothing can stop from cooperating. There's only so the trip agreement that was signed in Washington back in August 2025 is actually epitomized all the efforts of Azerbaijan that Azerbaijan was building in the last, I would say, 20 years. I mean, ever since that Baku-Ceyhan pipeline or Baku-Erzurum gas pipelines or all other kind of the networking or regional projects. Ever since 1994, 1995, Azerbaijan was trying to build a regional perspective or regional cooperation between Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. And if we remember that back in 1994, 1995, there was a discussions of building the pipelines and railroad system from Azerbaijan through Armenia to Turkey and further on to Europe, was one kind of the conditions to just resolve the Karabakh conflict. But that period of time that Armenia was in this kind of the denial period of time, and they didn't just go for the certain type of the cooperation. So the end of the Karabakh War and end of the certain type of this conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia actually opened a new opportunity. Finally, the dream of the European Union starting from 1993 when they had a certain project called Praseka or this right now, sometimes it's called Middle Corridor and so on. So the dreams of the globalist or regional people to connect all the countries of the Europe together with South Caucasus and Central Asia is kind of the coming true. So with this trip agreement, as Anna rightly mentioned, there's a lot of the small details, as we usually know, that devils in details, how all the paths, whether it's going to be only road or railroad or certain type of the pipelines. They're discussing about some pipelines, gas pipelines, oil pipelines. I'm not sure about that. So the time will show what exactly is going on. But it shows that it's finally this black hole that was existing in the South Caucasus that would connect the East with the West. It's over. And I'm really expecting that this trip agreement at some point will start kind of working. And within a year, 2026, Azerbaijan and Armenia finally will reach a peace agreement, will sign a peace agreement that will just completely unlock the situations, bringing this, opening the border between Turkey and Armenia, opening the borders, full-fledged borders with Armenia, Azerbaijan, and further on. The only problem so far that Azerbaijan is still believing it's kind of the certain type of the hurdle is that Armenian constitutions that is still have references to the Declaration of Independence of Armenia that put territorial claims on Azerbaijani territory. That document is somehow is making Azerbaijan uneasy because of the certain type of. It's very hard to live in the with a country who's your neighborhood who has a certain type of territorial claims on your territory. That's why Azerbaijan would push more for the, if not changes in constitutions, but at least to get rid of this such kind of the claim that Armenia claims on Azerbaijani territories. Finally, I would say that what is it will be a little bit cynical to say that, but the war between Russia and Ukraine, that the Russia aggression against Ukraine helped the countries of South Caucasus slowly to distance away from the Russia. So in the last almost 3 years of the war in Ukraine, and weakness of Russia showed itself in the South Caucasus, allowing both Azerbaijan and Armenia make such kind of the movement or make such kind of step that would be impossible to think back in 2019, 2020, or so on. So Azerbaijan was finally able to close the questions of the separatist regimes in Karabakh and was able to bring Armenia back to the desk of negotiations. And technically, what is right now going on with the peace agreement, I think it's inevitable. I mean, it will continue. I don't think there will be any hurdles, and I really hope that in 2026 this peace agreement will be signed, and the 2026, I would say, will be revolutionary in relations between Azerbaijan and Armenia. More I will talk about during the questions. So just to pass the floor to, I guess, to Natia or Mark, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anar. Next, we will hear from Mark Kramer. Mark is the director of the Cold War Studies program at the Davis Center. Mark, take it away.
Thank you very much, Ali. And let me thank both of the previous speakers, Anna and Anar. They have covered issues that will come up briefly in what I say with regard to the role of the United States. The one thing they didn't mention in referring to TRIP is what it stands for. So let me briefly mention for viewers who might not be intimately familiar with the agreement. It stands for Trump Route for International Peace and Prosperity, which is indicative of a point that Anna mentioned with regard to the personalization of this, of the joint declaration and proposed agreement. So the first thing I would emphasize, and I will get to the U.S. role, but let me just emphasize as someone who remembers when the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan began in 1988 and has observed it over the last 37 years. The major point I would emphasize at the beginning is this is a conflict that has started and restarted depending on shifts in power. Usually it has come to pauses because the power imbalance is so marked that there is an effort to reach some sort of ceasefire. But then over time, it restarts. And so this what the agreement signed in August have to be treated very carefully. I agree with the panelists that there is a real potential here to build a lasting peace agreement. But these documents were not it. They paved the way for it, but they do only that. They require sustained attention and involvement, including above all of the United States. The previous actor that had been involved in the process, as both of my colleagues mentioned, was Russia, and in particular Putin, in an attempt to exploit the conflict to build up Russia's influence in the region, I think in a very unsavory way. And so the Trump administration deserves credit in this case for having edged out Russia. There was no effort to coordinate, as had been feared, that perhaps Trump might make some sort of joint offer with Russia to be involved. And I think that would have been an unworkable situation, that this is much better the way the Trump administration has approached it. Now, there's no doubting that Trump himself sees this conflict and asked for recommendations of conflicts that he could be involved in based on his desire to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And his knowledge of this conflict, which he received briefing materials on it beforehand, but those have not kept him from occasionally naming the wrong countries involved. In one case, when he was meeting with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, he referred to Azerbaijan and Albania as the countries that had signed these accords. And then later on, he referred to Cambodia and Armenia. In that case, he got at least the name of one of the countries correct. Having said that, though, I do give Trump credit for his role in this. He was able to achieve something that the Biden administration had tried to do and basically failed at. The reason that that this conflict was brought to Trump at all is that there was a real sense on the part of experts within the government, especially the State Department, that this was a propitious time to pursue it because both sides had reached the point where they had a real stake in achieving peace in a way that they didn't after previous denouements or during previous pauses in the conflict. So this, the role of the United States was very important here. The transactional nature of it also, I think, is important, even though I don't like that aspect of the Trump administration's policy. In this case, it actually made sense in giving an economic basis, an economic stake to both countries in seeking to bring an end to the conflict. What I fear, though, and this is where I will end, is President Trump has trumpeted this as a historic peace deal, which it isn't. It paves the way for such a deal, but it isn't a peace deal in itself. I worry, though, that as he does with many other things, his attention span to this will be short, and he won't exert the continual need for involvement and influence that really is going to be crucial if there is going to be a historic peace deal. I do think there can be. For the first time, I will say, over the last 37 years, I am pretty confident that this time there could be. But without that kind of sustained involvement and influence, it's not going to happen. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Next, we will hear from my dear friend and colleague, Natia Chankvatadze. Natia is a peace-building scholar and practitioner affiliated with the Davis Center's program on Georgian Studies. Natia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alison, and thank you everyone who joined the discussion, and especially sincere thanks to panelists who agreed to participate in this conversation. Before I speak about the perspectives from Georgia or Georgia's role, if I can describe it that way, I want to mention that the program on Georgian Studies facilitates in every semester conversations around the South Caucasus in general, and the Black Sea region. In 2023 and 2024, there was this whole seminar series devoted to the Georgian Caucasus, and every year there is a conversation about the Iran, Turkey, and South Caucasus, and I do see Anna as a potential speaker for that next upcoming seminar, especially that your research on Turkey's role in the region is progressing. So I will say very brief remarks, twofold. The first is basically what is happening in Georgia for last 2 years, or maybe pretty much after April 2024, because the internal developments and the foreign policy shifts or foreign policy standing that we see does affect all these the regional projects or the cooperations. The crisis in Georgia that I can say really escalated in April 2024. For those of you who are following what's happening in the country, you probably know some of this story, but that happened when the current government of Georgia brought back the law that for them was for the transparency of foreign donations and grants. But the civil society actors and the media organizations and many experts claimed that the law was very similar to the Russian-style law on foreign agents. Well, retrospectively speaking, from today's point, we can say that it was definitely for that purpose, because the crackdown on the civil society organizations and media organizations really reinforced from that point. Another crisis in Georgia really erupted end of November last year again, when the Prime Minister said that Georgia would halt the negotiation process with the European Union accession until 2028, and that brought unprecedented number of people into the streets. And that crisis, I can say, that continues until now. Daily protests involved in it, and also arrests of people participating in December-January protests, and also that continues pretty much until today. So what we see in case of Georgia is that Georgia is really opening up towards east, if I can call it so, and moves away from its being the trusted and long-term partner with the European Union states, and probably it's fair to say that the Georgian-American relations are also quite strained at this moment. However, in case of Georgia standing in Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, here I need to mention that historically that position has been based on the impartiality and neutrality because of various reasons. And very first reason, it's the Georgia itself has the territorial conflict, so that the issue of territorial conflict is a very sensitive topic in the country and for all for the society or the political elite. Another very important reason is that the country has the significant amount of Georgian citizens who are ethnic Armenians and ethnic Azerbaijanis, and they live compactly in the southern part of the Kartli, in Samtskhe-Javakheti and Koemo-Kartli regions. Also, very important reason is, and Anar mentioned briefly about the pipelines and gas pipeline and oil pipeline, and the also the railway station. So it has been there has been a many infrastructural projects that goes especially those three infrastructural projects that goes through Georgia. And in terms of also Georgia's standing, I can recall probably the only high-level meeting that was between the Foreign Minister of Armenia and Foreign Minister of Azerbaijan in 2022 that happened in July. And probably this was at least very interesting meeting to observe, because this was the meeting, the quite high-level meeting without any usual third-party representation that we would see, let it be Moscow, Brussels, or Washington. Except that the one thing that is that has happened in Georgia throughout the years, that was the track 1.5, track 2, track 3 dialogue processes, and Georgia was a place for Armenian-Azerbaijan dialogue. It's very interesting what is happening to that dialogue and to those networks and groups of people right now, and if there is any thinking into this new peace deal or agreement, what should be this, where should this type of conversations continue. I also there are, because there was this a lot of different formats, and I will say briefly also one more point, and I will maybe conclude here, is that Georgia's participation in this new infrastructural project, which is so far just the potential project TRIP, is important, and it's a news of like week ago that has happened, that the senior advisor at the U.S. State Department visited Georgia, and that is connected to the potentially various different topics, but including the trip and the Georgia's potential participation, or the perspectives from Georgia towards it. There are other points, how it affects Georgia's place or the position to be the core middle corridor transit country, but I can reflect on it a bit later. So I will stop here.
Thank you, Natia. Thank you all for your presentations. I'll ask some questions and then we'll open up the floor to the participants. So make sure to post your questions in the Q&A at the bottom. Feel free to do that while we're still asking questions. We've got one so far, but hopefully we can get a couple more. Anna, so looking at kind of sovereignty versus connectivity, the agreement envisions a transit corridor, the trip route, connecting Azerbaijan to Nakhchivan through Armenian territory. Can you speak a little bit more to the kind of sovereignty risks for Armenia and how that might be mitigated?
Sure. I think I mentioned, I touched on it a little bit. The agreement itself is very clear. I think I don't see any sovereignty risks in the agreement for Armenia because it is built on principles of reciprocity. However, when it comes to, and it's built on principles of reciprocity, on, again, reinforcing Almaty Agreement, norms, all those norms that hold the international legal order together. So in this respect, because this region has been for so long, has been an extension of great power rivalries, regions, these dynamics of regionalizing these norms, which people can take it for granted in Latin America, have not transpired in South Caucasus. So as such, Russian influence, while even if Russia did not and does not have full influence over the region, it has succeeded in keeping the region fractured, which then makes it impossible, kind of dilutes the importance of these norms and makes violence as a legitimate instrument in solving conflicts. The fact that Nagorno-Karabakh conflict ended through a victor's peace, through violent means, as opposed to negotiated settlements on its own is very significant. Because studies show that conflicts that do end through negotiated settlements contribute to weakening of authoritarianism inside the successful victorious state. In regards to Armenian sovereignty issues, again, the agreement recognizes Armenian sovereignty. I don't see a threat in the language. However, when it comes to implementation, this is where the risks are for Armenia. And a lot depends as to how far, and Mark mentioned, to what extent will the United States protect and advance this agreement. The reason that I do see a risk for Armenia in terms of the implementation is that reciprocity is there, but not synchronization. I think immediately, and I wrote about this in my Carnegie piece on Turkey, immediately after the signing of the agreement, the revisionist rhetoric on Zangezur, that this is a Zangezur corridor, both in Turkey as well as Azerbaijan, continued. And that is a very, I do see that as problematic because prior, the Zangezur corridor language, President Aliyev has used in conjunction of using force, in getting it by force. Moreover, I think there is a potential of lawfare here, meaning that this peace process can be used by Baku in advancing a specific broader political goal, meaning, but even the insistence on the constitution needs to be updated. That is also part of this lawfare strategy because it allows Baku to keep influence over Armenian domestic politics. It's an open system, so it's vulnerable in that respect. So in this, whether implementation will be carried out, monitoring will be carried out, connectivity will be carried out in terms of physical synchronized development of infrastructure around Armenia. That is the key marker of the whether agreement will be successfully implemented. So the fact that there's still Azerbaijani soldiers inside Armenia's territory, I think, while the language, I think is very significant. And a lot will depend what type of regional statecraft do these countries use? What type of language do they use? Is there whether their domestic politics and foreign policy matches? In the Armenian case, I think yeah, the constitutional change needs to happen, but not because Baku insists, but because Armenia had a velvet revolution and has not revised its constitution. So it's something that Armenia's been talking about. But I think Baku Aliyev skillfully kind of attaches himself to that process and creates the impression and the fear in Armenia that this is a coercive process. The fact that Azerbaijan, Armenia has vote after vote voted for the peace process, voted for political forces that want to continue the peace process is hugely significant. So I think I have to concur with the Economist magazine here that the insistence on the constitutional change as a precondition to sign a peace agreement, that is a poison pill. That is not, that's not a real hurdle because the actual movement processes are happening. And by insisting on the constitution, it creates, delegitimizes the actual processes for the constitutional change that would be happening in Armenia. And again, I think the fact that our Azerbaijani soldiers are still inside Armenia, taking up significant strip of territory, this also contradicts the text. So I don't have no idea what conversations are happening in this respect. But the fact the agreement succeeded in preventing the formation of a territorial conflict, which Azerbaijan was trying to build on Armenia's territory on its own, I think this is very significant.
Thank you, Anna. Anar, so what do you think are the biggest risks to the sustainability of the peace deal from the Azerbaijan perspective? For example, maybe possibility of renegotiating terms of the corridor, external interference, or domestic backlash?
Well, we still don't have enough information about kind of the terms of the so-called, I mean, I don't want to use the word corridor because sometimes my Armenian colleagues don't like this word, the corridor. Let's call it a trip from that perspective. We still don't know the terms of the passing of Azerbaijani rails, cars, the people passing from the mainland of Azerbaijan to Nakhchivan. What Azerbaijanis actually want from this perspective, from the trip, is to unobtrusive and uninterrupted travel from the mainland of Azerbaijan through the Armenian territory to Nakhchivan and then further on to the Turkey. There is no intentions neither from Azerbaijani political elite nor from the populations to claim any territory of Armenia. Armenian sovereignty, Armenian territorial integrity is recognized by Azerbaijan, and the same way Azerbaijani territorial integrity recognized by Armenia. So there is no intentions of the grabbing certain type of the territory or cutting off certain the lands of Armenia and attaching it to Azerbaijan. So that's not the case over here. What Azerbaijan is trying to do is build for the whole region. So Azerbaijan is actually driving the whole development in the region, trying to attach the South Caucasus either to European Union and the Central Asia and further on to the West. So we are in the process of the global transformation of the world, specifically of global trade. If our region is able to even catch 5 or 10% of the transportation that happens between China and European Union, it's more than enough to make the whole region to become a Singapore. Not Panama Canal, as I always usually say. I don't want this our region become Panama Canal or Suez Canal, but I want our region become a more Singapore. So all other small things that we're just kind of debating over here, Azerbaijan is kind of trying to just become aggressor or grab this or grab that. That's without kind of the grounds, because technically we are in the process of the much more global issues that is goes beyond of us. What can put certain type of the obstacle for Azerbaijan in making this kind of the efforts? There's a few things. First of all, it's we are still in the really important moment of how the war in Ukraine is going to end. If the war ends with the assert of Russia coming out of the war. So then assertive Russia at some point will turn its kind of the attentions toward the South Caucasus. We don't need to forget the fact that Russia has a military bases in Armenia, in Gyumri, and meanwhile, I think the air base in near Yerevan. We don't forget that it was Azerbaijan who was able to actually force Russians to leave from Azerbaijani territory, so-called Russian peacekeepers that was in Karabakh. Azerbaijan was able to, I don't want to say kick them out, but just forcing them to leave Azerbaijan. And technically, there's no single Russian soldier that can prevent this certain type of the projects happening in Azerbaijan. So what I see that the problematic over here is Russian assertiveness coming back to the South Caucasus. It's a first thing. Definitely elections in Armenia. That's going to happen in summer. I think in the spring, summer period of time. I cannot say that we're supporting this Mr. Pashinyan or Prime Minister Pashinyan and so on. But so far, the kind of continue to negotiations and having a certain type of the discussions with the same partner that we had in the last couple of years, it will be much more preferable for Azerbaijan. And as for the constitution cases, again, for some people it will be considered as a not so important, but for Azerbaijan, that for the last 35 years was living under the Damocles kind of sword that there's a territorial claims of the neighboring country towards Azerbaijan. That's really important issue for us because we don't have a Georgians having a certain type of the territorial claim for Azerbaijan. We don't have any other countries having territorial claim for Azerbaijan. It's only Armenia. So what we want in order to just fix this problem, what we need is just to somehow stop Armenians referring to the certain type of the documents that put territorial claims on Azerbaijan. So again, my biggest concern again, it's not Armenia, it's not a certain type of the constitutional changes and so on, but it's also assertiveness of Russia when they come back to the region, if they come back. And once they come back, the revanchist powers in Armenia, together with the Russians powers, they will just kind of turn this whole peace process to the other directions, not very positive directions. So we have very short period of time, very kind of benevolent or favorite time to fix the problem, to solve the issues before Russians come back to the South Caucasus. Thank you.
Thank you, Anar. Natia, from a Georgian perspective, does the Armenia-Azerbaijan route pose a strategic challenge to Georgia's middle corridor role, or do you think it could kind of open up opportunities for broader regional cooperation?
Thank you, Alison. And one thing that when I was listening, one thing I wanted to mention is that there are more Russian bases in the South Caucasus. Actually, there are two in Tsatskin Valley and Java, and there are in Abkhazia, in Ochamchira region also. So there are enough Russian military representation already in Georgia's breakaway regions. To respond to your question, Alison, what I hear and what I read and what I'm thinking also, the very honest reaction is like we don't know yet, and we don't really know whether it's gonna be either yes or the no. Like, I mean, yes, it's gonna problematize Georgia's so for now this unique or the core position to be the key connector of in the middle corridor, but I do see also arguments for yes, and I do see arguments for no. I will start for the arguments why I think it might not be as problematic for Georgia's positionality. And the very first is actually going back to what we already heard. And Mark mentioned that at the beginning also that deal is like a potential. That is not something that is already ratified or signed. So we are still talking about something that is that should happen in the future. So, and we've already heard from Anna in many details why the implementation, how the implementation could have these the problematic aspects. However, even if it is really signed, ratified, it's gonna take time. It's gonna take I don't know, 5 to 7 years, maybe even more, to actually start the first the construction processes. While we already mentioned that there is an already existing infrastructural projects going through Georgia. It's an oil pipeline, it's a gas pipeline, it's a railway, and the Georgia is opening up its opening up into the west and allowing Chinese companies to come to the country, and not only. And here is where I am also leaning towards the response of yes, it can really challenge Georgia's positioning, and that is not necessarily argumented coming from this regional framework automatically sidelining the Georgia, but it is actually what's happening in the country, and if it portrays itself to be a reliable partner for its Western partners anymore. And I've mentioned already that Georgia is opening up to Chinese companies significantly. We have the Anaklia Black Sea port, which is sold to the it's still not finalized deal, but there is a Chinese consortium who should potentially build it. There is also different Chinese companies that are involved in building the highways and the roads, important road projects in Georgia. As of 2024, I was checking the statistics also on Gem News, and there is a statistics of 291 new Chinese companies registering in Georgia, and this is a very latest development of 2025. Conversations about this new Abu Dhabi-based company Eagle Hills potentially investing in Georgia. The conversations mentioned the number of $6 billion investment that is connected to one part of it to Tbilisi, and the another is connected to Ajara region, building basically the big residential areas, the parks and different things. And also a very interesting point here is that the agreement itself is actually not publicly available. So it's a commercial secrecy so far, and we don't really know what's really written in it. Saying all of this, we do see that the Georgia still remains as important connector, even in the European Union's global gateway project, or it still is mentioned in the European Union strategic approach to the Black Sea. But looking at how country tries to lean towards the allow this new new projects coming and has really little transparency around them. That brings me back to the initial response that I said I don't know. On the one hand, and I agree with Anar, what you said is that it can, if everything goes really well for all these three countries, it could really be a significant breakthrough and can really make the South Caucasus as a very important transit location for the China connecting to the European Union and beyond. But at this point, I don't think we have a strong responses towards either answer.
Thank you, Natia.
That would be my reflections.
Thank you. Okay, and last but not least, Mark, looking at the current geopolitical landscape, can you speak a little bit more about how the U.S. influence in the South Caucasus compare to Russia, Turkey, and Iran's influence in the region in the context of the peace deal, and maybe also broader in the geopolitical landscape?
Yeah, I mean, clearly there are several factors that affect U.S. involvement in the region. One of them has to do with diasporas. Armenia's diaspora is large. The diaspora from Azerbaijan and Georgia are much smaller. But another crucial one is clearly oil. That has been a constant in the approaches of previous administrations, and there Azerbaijan clearly has by far the most important role. That said, there were, going back 30 odd years, there have been many administrations, many in the State Department, the National Security Council staff. Those organizations function somewhat differently under the current administration than they have over the last 80 years or so. But still, there are enough experts still on hand to remember those earlier efforts. And by and large, they were not terribly successful. There were a few accomplishments in trying to mitigate the consequences of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but there was no real effort to forging a lasting agreement. And again, what I would stress is that somehow when Trump was looking around for conflicts and again seeking advice on conflicts he might be able to help resolve, someone, I presume in the State Department, approached him and or at least a group of officials approached him and recommended seeking to move at this point, which I mentioned was particularly auspicious time to seek a broader agreement than had ever been feasible in the past. The Biden administration, for example, and the Obama administration had sought to mediate in the conflict, but were never really successful. Again, they achieved some limited gains, but nothing that could be comparable to what has been in place since August of this year. So the what it reminds me of, if I wanted to draw some parallel, even though it's very different context, would be the role that Jimmy Carter played in the Camp David Accords in 1978. That agreement, was somewhat similar in laying out a framework that then led to the much more important treaty signed in the spring of 1979. But the importance of that process was that it also had a lot of details that needed to be filled in. And in fact, they were over the next subsequent months because the U.S. government remained deeply involved in that process and really pushed the two countries together at a time when they needed to be pushed, because they wouldn't have done it if there hadn't been that impression of external pressure or external encouragement. And that's what I worry about, but also hope for in this case, is that there will be sustained U.S. involvement in the process as some of the details get filled in. And there are many important things that need to be filled in if these documents are going to hold up as a lasting peace agreement. My colleagues have mentioned them. I too regard constitutional changes as an important thing. They don't need to occur early on, but at some point, I think that they are in Armenia are going to have to happen. Similarly, there is a great deal that will need to be filled in about the status of military forces in the region, including those that might be stationed to help prevent breaches of a future agreement. So there's a great deal that needs to be filled in, and it will be extremely important for the United States to stay involved. And I hope that will happen. I just worry, though, that the president, with his short attention span, his desire to hail this already as a historic peace agreement and to basically move on to the next conflict, will somehow sacrifice the important achievement that he has helped bring about. He should be proud of this, what he has achieved here, and should, I hope, continue to work on it to promote a lasting accord.
Thank you, Mark. Now we'll go to the Q&A section. I know I said now we have a lot of questions, so I hope we have time to get to them all. But the first question is about kind of humanitarian and human dimensions of the conflict. That says, what are the structural risks of relying on a peace framework that prioritizes technical arrangements but leaves unresolved the core human consequences of the conflict, and what dangers might emerge when a peace process lacks mechanisms to address these humanitarian grievances. It wasn't directed at an individual speaker. Would anyone like to respond?
Maybe it's better for Anna and Anar to respond, but I do want to chime in briefly, is to say there's no question that these documents did leave out that important element. Eventually, it's going to have to be addressed. The vast numbers of people that were displaced persons, the loss of property, many other elements are going to have to be addressed. But I don't see those as issues that should impede important steps that can be taken without moving on those very important elements about the human victims of the conflict.
Well, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay.
I'll
I think at some point both societies and both countries will come and just start a discussion of these humanitarian issues and social justice actually social injustices happened for the people from both sides, not only from Armenian side, but also from Azerbaijani side. We shouldn't forget about the 750,000 Azerbaijani IDPs, almost 7 or 8 times more. There were IDPs from Azerbaijan who lived around 30 years in this kind of the horrible conditions. So it's not only about Armenians, but it's also about Azerbaijanis. But so far today, this is extremely sensitive issue. And once we just bring the sensitive issues, it can, of course, unfortunately or fortunately, it can just make the peace process to a little bit complicated. So I think both societies and both countries understand it's better to just give more attention to the reconstruction efforts, to the transportation network, for economics and so on. And then at some point, when all other hurdles are done, I think there will be opportunities to come back to the issues that is really kind of problematic for the both societies.
If I could follow up, I think what I mentioned earlier as to what this agreement did and is not, again, I don't think this agreement was about Nagorno-Karabakh. I think this agreement functions, I think, as a non-aggression pact because it follows a prior rhetoric from Baku about taking a territory through Armenia, cutting through coercively by force. And this agreement really helped to change that dynamic and bring the region into the kind of normalized, so to speak, reinforcing international legal norms against conquest. However, I would like to say, though, what is interesting I think it is important to talk about the fact that the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict ended through a victor's peace. In this respect, Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, it's the decades of its peace process that were very weak, stands out, cuts against the grain from the global trends as to how these types of conflicts have been managed and resolved. On both sides, on the one hand, most ethnic conflicts, have been resolved inside the home state. In this case, it would be Azerbaijan, but they would be resolved by giving more rights to the minorities, strengthening territorial autonomy. So that has been the dynamic. And I think this was not the first or the last secessionist conflict. And again, the quantitative data shows that most conflicts have been, even in authoritarian states, minorities have been accommodated. So this is one end of the spectrum. And the fact that this did not happen and victor's peace transpired through ending in an ethnic cleansing, I think this is significant. On the other side, Nagorno-Karabakh's position is interesting because their position has also been maximalist. So there's huge scholarship as to why their position has been maximalist, as to why this conflict was not resolved early on when it emerged at the communal clashes level. And Russia does play a role, but I think the fact that the level of incompatibility has been so high and was not negotiated the conflict did not resolve through negotiated settlement is very problematic, not just for the people who suffered, but also for the region as a whole. And while the 1990s was a period where so-called liberal peace-building processes were being practiced, where minority rights were addressed, human rights were important. Over the past decade, we're seeing the rise of illiberal methods of conflict management. When the violence remains on the table, minority rights are not protected, and this is the signature Russian approach to conflict management, which I would argue that that's how Azerbaijan was also approaching this as well. So the possibility for this process at this point to address the social issues, I don't see the actors there, because I do find it, and again, the fact that this region does not have regional courts of human rights, right? In the text of the peace agreement, both sides agreed to take their cases back from the international courts. All of this does not bode well for addressing some of these issues. But in this capacity at this stage, I think this region is really not developed in terms of its human rights practices, its administrative structures to be able to protect, to address the massive human rights concerns, simply because even this conflict was not addressed through negotiated settlements. And again, I think I also find it problematic that even while negotiating through the peace process, I think Baku domestically continues to maintain a sort of an image of an enemy, continues to, of Armenia, continues to have this revisionist claims over all of Armenia's territory. So this juncture between domestic politics and foreign policy orientation is problematic. So a lot is going to bend how the three countries truly approach their regional statecraft, how they exercise their regional statecraft. And one more point to add, when we do talk about regional autonomy, regional integration, pipelines and infrastructural power, that's all well and good. That's important, but they have very limited, I wouldn't say limited, on their own, they're not as significant in generating regional autonomy that will eventually produce regionally organized markets. And this is the conditions under which all three states can develop in the future and can resist the new imperial pressures coming from bigger powers. So I think we also have to be detailed and specific as to what do we mean by regionalism. Is it pipelines? I don't think it's just pipelines and trades and railroads. It's down the road trade integration, free trade in particular. On their own, these markets are tiny. I've studied this in the Western Balkans. I've studied this in Latin America. They're not interesting to investors. So I will stop here and just say that I hope that this is a beginning to building actually regionally, a politically autonomous region. But when it comes to human rights and social issues, you do need institutions to address those issues. And so far, we have been eradicating institutions of regional governance as opposed to building it.
Just very quickly chime in. I mean, what Anna has said, though, is applies as well to previous iterations of this conflict, that these issues were not handled in a way that would encourage that kind of reconciliation, or whatever you want to call it. Quite the contrary. And the situation now is closer to the status quo ante 37 years ago, almost 38 years ago, than it was during earlier iterations of the conflict. And so it is certainly true, all of what you said, Anna, that this isn't going to address, even if it, the best image of it comes to fruition, it isn't going to address some of these crucial issues. But I still don't think that those obstacles will be allowed to keep this from leading to a more lasting peace agreement than has been possible in the past.
I agree, Mark. Fully agree.
And yeah, can I say very, very briefly here, because I saw the person who posted that question, Margarita, and I know, like, so I think my very quick reaction to it would be to go back to Anna's very first point that she said, the describing the agreement or the deal as a non-aggression pact, and that kind of makes sense to me why, for example, all these aspects of the, as we call it, the human security dimension, or the reconciliation or the responding to the traumas is not reflected in India. And I have 2 points. One is if you look at the previous agreements and previous cases and how significant work was done in that direction. And the second is if you leave that kind of part really absent for a long time, it does really these unaddressed traumas and the like really traumatic memories that people carry really become a mobilizing capital. So that means that if we talk or we want to see this deal go through and become sustainable, that can actually be a really core impediment to it, even though we do believe that the conversations and the more or less technocratic nature of this deal and agreement right now does not necessarily need this type of I don't know, agreement at this stage, and should happen tomorrow. So it's a very important question, Margarita, and I really hope that the conversations are happening in parallel regarding that part of the document, because these two societies, it's really deeply traumatized out of this war, and you can't simply sideline and ignore that aspect. And I'm not going to bring the Georgia's case and experience here, but we do see also how that grievances, the traumas can become demobilizing capital, not necessarily in a good way. So that would be very briefly.
And the next question is for Natia, asking whether the Georgian government views the trip as a threat to Georgia's current monopoly on the east-west transit from Azerbaijan to Turkey.
I saw Neil, Professor McFarlane posted that question, and thank you very much. I think in my second, when I spoke in response to your question, Alison, I did explain what I thought. If that is a threat to the Georgia's monopoly, it's again yes and no answer. I don't think there is a very one straightforward answer to it, and whether it will be a threat to Georgia's monopoly, I think can be decided by Georgia itself pretty much, and depending how the country is going to handle this situation. But one more very quick point here is that when Georgia, similar to probably Turkey, was really absent from the 2025 negotiation process, but there is a common consensus between ruling party, political elite, and the opposition leaders. Everybody congratulated, and starting from the prime minister going to each of the opposition leaders. So there was this kind of very united response to and positive feedback to the agreement. But yeah, so far Georgia has been absent from that conversations, at least what we see publicly.
This next question is for Anna from Sophie Bedford. Anna, could you say a bit more about the upcoming elections and how it could affect the peace process?
Sure, that's a very good question. So I think overall, even after, if you recall, after the 44-day war in 2020, Armenia was in the midst of political crisis, and many worried that Armenian democracy is not going to hold up. But I was actually cautiously optimistic that we will hold up, simply because studies do show that democratic transitions that happen through civic disobedience campaigns, which Armenia's Velvet Revolution was, are more likely to endure. And indeed, Armenia was effective in solving its political crisis through the ballot box and through the snap elections. The Pashinyan government campaigned on the peace agenda and actually surprised many, despite losing a war, succeeded in getting the support and essentially with a majority in the parliament. And I would argue that while right now there's a lot of discontent in general, there's fear. I think it's a lack of trust, and it's not surprising as to whether to trust the peace process or not. For some of the reasons I mentioned already, but I think overall the election after election, I think the government, the political process, the people do support the peace process. And I do think, and the trip as an agreement is very much helps to reinforce. It's a dividend. I think it kind of connects with continuing with the peace process. And I haven't seen opinion polling yet, and we'll start seeing them perhaps in the spring. But I think if I were judging on some of the dynamics, I would say that there is significant support, I think, for the peace process. I think there's massive shift in Armenian political understanding of where do they see. I think these narratives of a Russian security sort of savior complex has been diminished. Turkey's role in the region is being reassessed. I think I would argue that people will continue with their support of the peace process, which is very much linked to the TRIP agreement. Much of the sort of contestation that you hear, not all, because there are justifiable fears as to, again, whether the fact that the peace agreement the text is agreed and not finalized, but Azerbaijan isn't putting its signature on it. I think that alone creates all kinds of fears. But I think overall, much of the sort of skepticism or push against the agreement comes from illiberal elite, so to speak. Not all opposition is like that. Some is justified, but Russia-linked factors, definite forces, political economy, again, matters. They definitely argue against it, saying that Armenia is losing sovereignty, which the text is negotiated in a way that Armenia does not lose sovereignty. But again, a lot will depend on how it will be implemented, which is why I argue that Baku actually, by not signing, insisting on constitutional change, which Armenia needs anyway, and will remove the clause from the preamble anyway, but by maintaining all of these things, Baku allows to create divisions inside Armenia, which keeps institutions weak. So I do think it is a lawfare strategy from Baku's part. But I think even with those, I think Russian place in Armenia has been hugely reassessed, if I could put it that way. Armenia's EU tilt is also playing a big role, diversification of its foreign policy. I think there's significant push and support for the peace process. And I am cautiously optimistic.
Our next question is from Zitong Yang. I think probably Anar and Mark can answer it, but keep our questions brief because I think we have a lot of questions in the chat. Hopefully we can get to a couple more of them. This question is about how we should assess the future direction of Azerbaijan's foreign policy, and do you expect its relations with the United States, Europe, and Turkey to become even closer? And what about its stance towards Russia?
What I would say that Azerbaijan foreign policy toward the all countries of the region, whether it's United States or Russia, Iran, I would say even Israel or China, it could be called so-called silent diplomacy. So it kind of the distancing from everyone to not just getting to kind of passing through the red lines, because approachment of Azerbaijan with NATO will immediately irritate Russians or Iranians. Or approachment of Azerbaijan with China would immediately bring certain type of the concerns from United States and European Union. This vice versa. So Azerbaijan right now is located in such kind of the region that breaking a certain type of passing through the red lines, it's very easy to do. So what Azerbaijan in future will try to do is to come up with a certain type of the new type of the regionalism, bringing together Central Asia together, South Caucasus together with Central Asia, and to bring certain type of the umbrella organizations into these countries, similar to the organization of Turkic states, or certain type of organization called 5+1. It's the 5 Central Asian countries and Azerbaijan, and further on in future bringing Georgian and Armenia to this type of the consultative body. So technically what Azerbaijan is trying to do to build up a new architecture of security, trying to be not close to any center of the power, to not irritate another center of the power, but meanwhile to become a so-called regional player that other big players would be kind of taken into consideration.
Oh, Mark, I think you muted.
Having listened to Anar, I would agree with what he said, but let me just add a couple of things. These documents, I think, have significantly mitigated Russia's role to cause mischief in the region, and in that respect are healthy. Obviously, Russia, given its proximity, is going to have to be involved in some capacity or another, but these really limit its ability to undermine everything and keep the region unstable. So but let me just say, with regard to the United States and its relations with Azerbaijan and with Armenia, here again, I think that those in the administration who sensed it was a good time to move on this conflict were absolutely right, because the crucial factor, as it was between Israel and Egypt in 1978 and 1979, is that both sides were ready to accept peace, but needed an external mediator to help bring it about. And that's where I see this opportunity now as being similar to that opportunity previously, but as not having existed in the last 38 years in dealing with this conflict. So I too, like Anna, am cautiously optimistic about this. I would be more optimistic if I felt the president was going to be willing to have sustained involvement of the United States in the whole process, which again could happen, but is not guaranteed. And so that's where I worry about any, that things could fall apart.
Okay. All right, we got 8 minutes left, so I'm going to try and get to two more questions. This one is for Anna from Neil McFarlane. If Armenia has recognized Azerbaijan's territorial integrity, why don't they just remove the Nagorno-Karabakh claim from the constitution?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm so glad that that question is asked. So the constitutional changes, as you can imagine, they do take time. So Armenia has recognized Azerbaijan's territorial integrity on multiple platforms, and Armenia has been, this particular government has been very vociferous and consistent in bringing back and reinforcing the Almaty Agreement, which essentially clarifies that the international borders in the region will essentially will follow the Almaty Agreement, the fall of the Soviet Union. So I think, so as to the constitution that was created, it was created with the formation, with the creation of the Armenia's First Republic. So after the Velvet Revolution, Armenia has been talking and will be needing, I think the biggest stakeholder for Armenia's new constitution is the Armenian people, right? Are the Armenian people. And that process is going to take place, and there are conversations happening. And once that happens, of course, they will be removing. They're not going. I think the political question as to whether Armenia has a claim of Azerbaijan, that has been debated, discussed, and reinforced inside Armenian context, which is why I argue, and again, the Constitutional Court, I think legal theorists, probably practitioners would have answered this question better, but the Constitutional Court also has looked at the text of the peace processes, and there's language in the peace process which says that once in the peace agreement, it says that the peace agreement, once signed and ratified, that takes precedent. It's more important, takes over the domestic. It takes over the domestic jurisdictions of each country, so it will supersede. I was doing interviews in Turkey, and there are Turkish analysts who were frustrated that the constitutional clause is being used as a hurdle in not signing the peace agreement. And one analyst argued that, yes, actually, he was a diplomat, I'm blanking on his name, that once you sign a peace agreement that goes through the UN process, it becomes ratified. So moreover, a question that is problematic, I think, as problematic, if not more, is that Azerbaijan's own constitution does not recognize the Soviet experience. Maybe Anar can talk about that as well. Does not. So whether that is also an issue, should there be some broader constitutional region-wide forum to make sure that all of the three constitutions align by the international order? But in respect, I'm very I've looked at this question quite closely. I am convinced that Baku does use the constitution, insistent on changing the constitution as a lawfare strategy, because Baku has has demonstrated in the rhetoric. President Aliyev has kept violence, war as legitimate use to pursue goals. So with any type of constitution that Armenia signs is not the determined important, but not the most important factor in shaping Azerbaijan's policy. I hope I'm wrong. But I think at this point in time, if Baku did sign the peace agreement, that would really completely change the dynamic. You would still need all kinds of things to implement, strengthen a peace agreement. There is a lot of things that go in as to what makes a peace agreement functional. But if a peace agreement would be signed and ratified, that would take precedence over and would give Armenian political system breathing room to continue with its constitutional processes of constitutional change. The fact that Armenian geopolitical strategic language has shifted completely, the public understanding of its friends and foes, its geopolitical, cultural understanding, societal understanding of geopolitics completely shifted. That is a given. But I think by keeping the peace process hostage to it, considering that have been all kinds of other ways to signal, to legally reinforce that the peace agreement takes precedence over the constitution, that has been done. There's a lot of writing on this as well, and I think talking to lawyers also would reinforce this point.
Anar, do you want to have any comments on that? Okay, we'll go to the next question.
Just very quickly, Ali, is here, though, I think on this issue, synchronization is going to be very important, that there will have to be at least some indication that at some point Armenia will proceed with constitutional changes. It's just that it doesn't have to come now or in the near future. It shouldn't be allowed to impede progress, but there has to be some indication that it will eventually, yeah.
Okay, I think we'll do one more question and then we'll sign off. So this question is from I'm going to pronounce this name wrong. I'm very sorry. Aika Ergun. There's two questions for Anar and Anna. What do you think are the perceptions among the public about the durability of the peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan? And do you think a new cohabitation of both parties on the same territory will be possible?
Well, perception in Azerbaijan about the peace agreement is pretty much positive. So everybody, most of the whatever the kind of the public opinion polls talking about or just discussions is going on, everybody is positive that the peace agreement will be signed in 2026, and that will open up the economic, transport, and political cooperations with Armenia within the larger region of the South Caucasus. So pretty much positive, and I don't think this public in Azerbaijan believe that something can impact the signing of the peace agreement, especially after the trip agreement. And the issue is not whether it will be signed or not, but the question is when it's going to be signed and how fast it's going to be signed. It's the first question answer. As for the cohabitations, I totally believe that the cohabitation is a future between Armenian and Azerbaijani communities in Armenia, in Azerbaijan. I don't think that there is some kind of the in-depth hatred between Azerbaijani and Armenians compared to other countries. I don't think there's lots of there was not done so much atrocities to remember about this certain type of the problems. So I would say that the future, pretty much, I'm very positive about that. It may take a while, but it depends on all the actions of the government. So if the governments of both countries agrees, I think the rehabilitations or reconciliations can become much faster than what we can experience right now.
That is such a good question. I would argue that in thinking about conflict processes, I always distinguish between social peace and political peace. And very often it's very hard to distinguish the two. I think it's problematic and sad and tragic that the two countries have separated. There has been no contact between one another. There is a rich history of coexistence during Soviet years, as well as in the prior periods. Of course, in the pre-Soviet period, that history has been, so the Transcaucasia stands out as a region of hybridity. There were communal clashes, but also coexistence. So I would say that what the peace process promises is massive through infrastructural connectivity, hopefully through growing intergovernmental cooperation. When bureaucrats start talking, start coordinating, transgovernmental links become formed. Slowly there has to be, without economic, maybe I'm like being too much of a liberalist here, without a deep, sustained, deepening economic contact, it might be difficult to advance reconciliation, and that is a difficult word as well in general. I do think that it's the political piece that has been more difficult, and I don't see animosity inside Azerbaijan, inside Armenian societies. I am worried that anti-Armenian hatred has been institutionalized in the educational books, and that is problematic inside the Azerbaijani state. In Armenian side, that doesn't take place, but at the same time, I think a lot of work needs to be done in Armenian society as well. There is a lot of fear, especially after the 2020 war. So I would say that re-engagement, economic interaction is going to contribute to making slowly deepen societal contact, including cohabitation. But again, I think economic contacts probably will need to be significant. The fact that for any peace agreement to be successful, you do need civic actors. And I think I do find it problematic. On the one hand, you see civil society, civic groups visiting each other a couple times already. That's wonderful. But at the same time, there are peace activists that are arrested inside Azerbaijan. So they're kind of the contradictory developments are happening inside Azerbaijan. But I think there's a lot of work to be done on Armenian side as well in explaining what peace looks like. It's not right now. I think we have the good problem in the region and in Armenia to start thinking about what peace looks like when beyond intergovernmental political conversations between their leaders. What does that mean? Would you travel to Azerbaijan if given the opportunity? Would you build businesses? And if you compare this region to Western Balkans, which had a very bloody war, US brokered agreements, the Dayton Accords, even there, the contact was very difficult, despite the fact that there was massive European American presence on the ground in terms of the massive infrastructure of organizations, non-governmental organizations, free trade agreements that were being pushed. Even there, it has been difficult. So I think in contrast to the Balkans, we have this Trump's commercial peace without any deep institutional support to incentivize interethnic contacts, to incentivize dialogue groups. There has been a lot of Armenian-Turkish dialogue groups that have been happening over the past few decades, and I think that can be replicated with relative to Armenia-Azerbaijan. But compare between Armenia-Turkish versus Armenia-Azerbaijan dialogue groups, Armenia-Turkish dialogue track is much, much more advanced than Armenia-Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you to all of our speakers today.
Ali, could I just very quickly chime in? Anna mentioned just quickly, but the Dayton Peace Accord of 30 years, a little over 30 years ago, and that again, it is a highly imperfect agreement. It has not brought about any reconciliation within Bosnia. If you go, especially to Republika Srpska, you'll find the same degree of animosity that there was 30 years ago. However, what it has done is to bring 30 years of peace. And, that's an important accomplishment. It doesn't lead to a lasting reconciliation and rapprochement, but it's not nothing either. So that's what I hope can come of this, too.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for speaking with us here today. I'm also going to put in the chat an upcoming webinar that the Program on Georgian Studies has, and a link to our mailing list. And a big thank you again to our speakers and to the Program on Georgian Studies for hosting this conversation. And I'm looking forward to a lot more continued conversations on the South Caucasus going